This week on Information Technology Leaders, Charlie Fink, president of the AmericanGreetings.com network. Now, here's your host, Laura Schildkraut.
Today's guest is currently the president of the AmericanGreetings.com network, which includes BlueMountain.com, eGreetings.com, and other popular sites. He moved to Hollywood early in his career and soon became the youngest VP at Disney. He's also a leading character in the book Digital Babylon: How the Geeks, the Suits, and the Ponytails Tried to Bring Hollywood to the Internet. In that book, he's described as irrepressible, enthusiastic, and blustery. But I just think of him as an old friend. We met in 7th grade at a small private school. We both had a passion for writing back then and were the only two people in a newly formed creative writing class taught by the school's headmaster. We lost touch after graduation, and then last summer I read a blurb about him in our high school's newsletter. I promised myself I'd get in touch before the end of the year and finally sent him a Voice from the Past email at 11:58 on December 31st. So with newfound admiration and rekindled friendship, I hope it's not another 23 years before we speak again. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Fink.
Thanks for the warm welcome.
You're welcome. What do you remember about growing up in Westchester, New York?
Well, I like to say that it was one of those suburbs where it was great to be a little kid. It was really boring to be a teenager there. And it's the kind of place where when you have kids of your own, you immediately go back to.
Right.
So in that sense, it was great. And I think probably very typical of anybody who, grew up in the middle or upper middle class suburbs of a big city, whether it's, Seattle or Washington, D.C. I live in the northern Virginia suburbs of Washington now. And, we live in a big house in a cul-de-sac, and my kids are having a childhood which is very similar to the one that I had, except there are more organized, more competitive sports, and way better distractions than I had.
Than you had back then.
Right, they have the internet, they have unbelievable console games with PlayStation 2 and Nintendo 64. I mean, it's just the toys that they have are so much better
than the toys that you had.
Yeah, exactly. And they have satellite TV and all this great stuff. So it's I don't know whether or not their quality of boredom is as good as mine was, because what I had was books.
Right.
Right. I mean, there were 5 channels in suburban New York, and most of it was the 900 Club.
Right. And we were glad to have that.
Yeah,
at that
exactly.
point.
So, in those days, everybody was watching the same primetime TV shows, which were, insufferably insipid.
Right.
So, I gravitated to books, which, I wish my kids were engaged with more. But on the other hand, had I had the internet, I probably would have spent more time there. Although I'll tell you something funny about the internet, and your viewers who have preteen and teenage children will relate to this. When we were growing up, we would call our friends and have these insufferable phone conversations. What are you doing? Nothing. What do you want to talk about? I don't know. And, of course, they view their internet communications as, extremely private. My 14-year-old, if you walk into the room when he's doing instant messages, throws himself across the screen as if, he's... makes you wonder, well, who's he talking to? What's going on there? And of course, then he walks away, not even thinking about it, and you look at these 20 instant messages, and they all are, what are you doing? Nothing.
Really
Same thing, different tools.
Yeah, it really isn't all that different at all. And that's a lot of the things that happened. I mean, even how writing used to be very important, and then writing wasn't important, and suddenly now that we're all on email, writing becomes important again.
Yeah, except shorter.
Yes, much shorter and much
more
quicker.
bite-sized.
Yes, truly. How would you describe what you were like in high school?
Well,
Besides bored.
Nobody really knows what they were like in high school. So there are two views of what you were like in high school. One is how you felt, and the other is how people viewed you. And, I felt, very lonely, very frustrated, very bored. But, I think other people thought I was very energetic, very creative, very popular, very engaged. I ran into somebody from high school about 5 years ago who said to me, "You were the most popular guy in school." I'm like, "What?" You must be getting me mixed up in your memory with somebody else.
When you look at what yourself was like, at that point, the mirror gets very different.
So let me ask you, what was I like in high school?
all I really remember was the writing. I just remember that you were a really good writer. That's
Well,
the main thing that
thank you.
I remember.
I worked in the literary magazine. That was
Right.
one of my big things, that and the drama club.
Yeah.
So there were some great creative outlets, and I gravitated to those two things.
One of the things that you said when we were talking about this is that the school, which was the small, kind of pretentious private school that we both attended, was too small a pond for you to reinvent yourself. Why did you feel you needed reinventing?
Well, I think that I probably, when I made that comment, was thinking about the situation that we find ourselves in with our oldest son, who's going to private school now, and actually we're switching him back to the public high school. But the small pond thing is actually a recurring theme in my life and in my career. And although I didn't realize it at the time, you know, was going to Hackley, and I got to be, you know, a relatively big fish, because we had in our class, I don't know, less than 100 kids.
72 people, yeah.
Right, so you get to star in the high school play, and you get to be the star of the baseball team, and you get to, you know, edit and write half the stories in the literary magazine. And in a high school with 4,000 students, you don't get to do all those things. So, and interestingly, when I went to college, I gravitated to Sarah Lawrence, which was small and arts-oriented, although when I got there, you know, Sarah Lawrence is set up more like a graduate school, and I was totally not able to take advantage of that when I was 17. So I left and I went to Columbia for almost 2 years, and then I came back to Sarah Lawrence, and that was great. So everything that I hated about it when I was 17, when I was 21, was great.
Perfect, yeah.
And then, you know, throughout my career, when I was at Disney in the animation division, and we were 55 people reinventing this spectacular art form, and I got to make a difference, that was very powerful, and I was very successful there. And then they promoted me to the live action side of the company, where I was a little fish in a big pond with a lot of sharks, and that was way less fun for me.
Yeah.
And similarly, when I was at AOL, I had a lot of success when I was, I don't know, the 900 and something employee at AOL. I thought I was going to a relatively large company, but I was able to make a difference there. And then when AOL became 14,000 and eventually 80,000 people, you know, you become just another layer of middle management. So that sort of big fish in a small pond theme has recurred. And, you know, the lesson from that is, you know, I like smaller companies where I can make a difference and be more entrepreneurial, and there are less rules and less politics, and you could have a more intimate relationship with people.
Yeah. I think one of the things that also is interesting, that as you move forward in your career, you start to learn more and more about what's important to you, and you find yourself in situations where something's bugging you, and it's much easier to figure out what that is. And if you sort of look through your career, you do tend to leave places when the pond gets to be too big.
Yeah, I mean, I leave places when I tend not to be as successful or rising as quickly. You know, the other thing is, you know, I'm a great builder. You know, I love to create things, often from nothing, and work closely with a team of people to create something, hopefully, that can be big and successful. But once that thing is built, you know, the creators and the entrepreneurs give way to what I call the maintainers. Other people might call them bean counters or middle managers. And maintaining is much less glamorous and interesting and compelling than building.
And your skills are certainly better placed in the building side.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they're more around vision. When did you decide that writing wasn't the right avenue for you? Because you certainly had the talent to do well at it.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I'm not sure about that, because part of being successful at writing is not knowing how to just craft words, but it's also having the temperament of a writer and the patience of a writer. So I had some of the qualities that might have led me to be a successful writer. I probably would have been more successful at it had I gravitated toward journalism rather than fiction writing.
Right.
But I wanted to tell stories, and I was and am and continue to be interested in storytelling. And so when I went to college, one of the reasons I chose Sarah Lawrence was because it has such a strong writing program. While I was there, however, I started to get interested in media and film. And I thought that was a good avenue and outlet for my desire to tell stories and my desire to apply my writing. And of course, the audience for stories in prose is much smaller than the audience for stories in film or television. And I always wanted a big audience. So I gravitated toward film, and it attracted me and engaged me on a number of levels. It's much more complex. You have to interact with a lot of different people and a lot of different elements to make a successful multimedia project or film project or television. It certainly requires, especially when you're a student, a tremendous amount of energy to write, direct, cast, act, edit, produce, everything that's required to put together even a 5-minute film. And that was a good use of my energy because I am energetic today. When I was 21, I was bouncing off the walls. I didn't know what to do with all that energy. So
it certainly wasn't sit in a room and be isolated and write.
Right, and of course, the worst thing about sitting in a room and being isolated and writing is you don't get continuous feedback. Right, so if you're really good and you really are disciplined, you toil away for months, and if it's a novel, perhaps years before saying, well, here it is, the last 3 years of my life, be kind to me, and that's brutal.
Yeah.
And I did not enjoy that part of it, I have to say. So I gravitated toward film, and then I went to graduate school in film after college, and then started working in the film industry in Chicago after I got out of school.
You talked about before when you decided to go to graduate school. Was that a popular decision with your parents? Did they go along with that?
I wondered if you had asked my father about that, because he was very old school, and when I told him I wanted to go to film school, he was both apoplectic and also full of good advice. And what he said at the time was, look, Chuck, you want to go to law school, I can pay for law school. He's an old Brooklyn guy, so I'm trying to do his accent. You want to go to law school, I can pay for law school. You want to go to medical school, I'll find a way to pay to medical school. You want to be in the movie business, move to frickin' Hollywood. And of course, I want to make my own films, Dad, and I had, a great 21-year-old rationale for that. And we argued about it for quite some time. I applied to, the usual list of pedigreed film schools, UCLA, USC, NYU, and I got into all of them. But they were expensive. It was like going to law school. But I got a teaching fellowship at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I thought, there was a part of me that said, maybe I don't really want to be in Hollywood. Maybe teaching film or film studies is more me, and I'm an intellectual and I'm interested in writing about popular culture, and maybe that's a better fit. So the Art Institute offered me a teaching fellowship, which meant no tuition and a job. So it was a good deal, and that was sort of a compromise that my father could live with, because the prestige of it somehow justified the detour. So that was, and then the Art Institute of Chicago was truly, independent study. I mean, it was like, okay, here's the equipment, here's your job, see you in 2 years.
And did you enjoy that? The independence of that and the autonomy?
Well, the first 6 months I was pretty terrified because, I just make a film? I mean, but actually I made a feature film when I was in graduate school. A friend of mine worked in a lab, and we got short ends and free processing, and sort of shot a feature film documentary style, mostly improvised with just an outline called Door to Door, which did very well in the festival circuit when it came out in 1983. And that was a film within a film within a film. A critic called it a conundrum of mirrors interesting to graduate students and cats. So it was very well suited to the festival circuit. It was, secretly released on video. I think there were 5,000 copies of the video released, and it sort of, got me going in the film industry. Although I don't know why. Call me crazy. I couldn't understand why anybody wouldn't hire me as a director after that film.
Experience.
But I did get lots of jobs as a production assistant. So
what did you end up doing with all that education? What did you do next?
I worked as a production assistant.
Which is exactly what you would have done.
Right, I'm like the guys running cameras here at the University of Washington. I did video assist. I helped to edit TV commercials. I was a production assistant, a location scout. Anybody who would pay me $100 a day, I did it. And I worked on a number of Hollywood productions. I worked on a film called One More Saturday Night. And then I got a job working as the producer's assistant for Gary Marshall and Alex Rose on a picture called Nothing in Common, which was shot in Chicago in 1985. It was Jackie Gleason's last movie. It was an early Tom Hanks film. And it was a lot of fun. And I had this relationship with Gary and Alex, and Gary kept saying, we're going to get you out to Hollywood. You'll come to Hollywood and work for us. And sure enough, a couple weeks after they left, Alex called me and said, do you want to come to Hollywood and work for us as our story editor? I said, great. What is a story editor? Well, basically you read scripts and run out for lunch, which was a kind way of saying secretary. So I was a producer's assistant, and so with all that education, I became a secretary. And it was great because that is the entry-level job in Hollywood. Whether you have a MBA or a JD or a MFA from the American Film Institute, 99 times out of 100, if you're really serious, you start out as an assistant. And if you're lucky, you're an assistant to somebody who will be a bit of a mentor to you. But what you really do is you end up in this network of other ambitious 25-year-olds. And that's your class. That becomes like your, like your law school class, or your business school class, and that's your class. So, a lot of the people that I came up with now run agencies and are presidents of studios and producers. And, whenever I see a movie now, I see, 2 or 3 names that I recognize of people who are continuing to fight their way through Hollywood, which is way more difficult today than it was, when I was there in the mid-'80s through the mid-'90s.
Yeah. How did it feel to be working with people who were famous?
One of the stupid things about me, and one of my great gifts, was that I really didn't notice. I treated Tom Hanks and Warren Beatty the same as I treated, the gaffer on the set. And I think that people like that about me.
Yeah, I was going to say that may be why you've done so well.
People like that about me. I have not been, I'll tell you who intimidated, Mike Leisner intimidated me. But, Tom Hanks, not at all.
Then after a few years with Alex Rose, you were ready to move on, and you had 3 offers. And that was sort of a turning point for you. Tell us about those offers and why you picked.
Let me clarify that a little bit. What you do basically in networking your way through Hollywood is, other assistants recommend you for things. So somebody who I had known in Chicago, Cynthia Sherman, had moved to Los Angeles, and she and I had lunch together, and she was looking for a job. She was the assistant artistic director at the Apollo Theater, or the Steppenwolf Theater, one of the well-regarded small creative theaters in Chicago. And Bette Midler's producer, Bonnie Bruckheimer, was a friend of Alex's. And Bonnie came by my desk and said, I need to find a Charlie for Bette and I. I said, well, okay, I'll keep my ears open, but there's only one Charlie. And so as soon as she left, I called Cynthia and said, hey, Bette Midler has a job right? For a story editor, call her up. And she got that job. And so she was walking across the Disney lot a couple of weeks later, and she ran into somebody she knew from Chicago, Peter Schneider, who was then the shaved-tail lieutenant vice president in charge of the animation studio. And he said to her, oh, God, I need to find somebody to help me figure out how to reinvent the animation studio, somebody who's creative but knows how to manage artists. She said, I have the perfect person. He went to art school. So she called me up and gave me Peter's number, and my wife was teaching at Cal State Dominguez Hills at the time, and I called her up and I said, bring every book in the library about Walt Disney home with you. And that weekend I crammed like crazy, and then I went to meet Peter and I said, oh, I studied Disney extensively when I was in film school. And so I got a job offer as a creative executive, which is a kind way of saying junior executive. And I had gotten more or less simultaneously an offer from Paramount to do the same thing for their live action group. And interestingly, when I didn't take the job at Paramount, and I'll get back to that in a second, I actually called a friend of mine and said, hey, listen, I just turned down a job.
That's perfect for you.
And he actually is now a producer and works with Sidney Pollack at his company called Mirage, and did produce The Talented Mr. Ripley, a guy named Bill Horberg. But that was an interesting choice. Paramount live action, Disney animation. And, it was essentially the same amount of money. I think Disney was offering me a little bit more. But, it was an exciting opportunity. Katzenberg and Eisner had come into the studio a year before. They wanted to reinvent the animation division, which had 55 people in it. The median age of the personnel there was 55. They wanted to make one new movie a year. They hadn't made a really successful animated movie since Jungle Book in 1967. And of course, all the guys there had worked on it. Of course, they all thought that The Great Mouse Detective was successful.
Right.
So, there was definitely a lot of rebuilding to do there. And I like the opportunity to work with artists and to build something new. So I took that opportunity, and just, my sense was that something was going to happen there that was going to be exciting, and that it was a big opportunity to be different, to differentiate myself from all the other junior executives in Hollywood and do something special. Of course, I didn't in my wildest dreams understand how special that was going to be, and that I was going to be part of the team that made Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King. But it was quite a ride and very exciting.
So what was Bambi in Africa?
Well, Bambi in Africa was, everything in Hollywood, every successful movie in Hollywood starts out as an elevator pitch, which actually, when I became an entrepreneur, I immediately took that. You have to tell the story of the movie to the head of the studio in an elevator in 2 floors. So, my job as creative executive, and I became vice president of creative affairs for feature animation, and I was in charge of story development, which really meant figuring out what stories we should develop as animated movies. And there's quite a complex process because it involved not only writing, but also the creation of a musical and the creation of something that was uniquely visual. And so one of my ideas was, if you look at the Disney oeuvre, most of the successful movies are girl movies. There are only 2 successful boy movies, Pinocchio and Bambi. All the other ones are girl movies. Maybe you could say Dumbo was a boy movie, but he was an infant, so it doesn't really fit into the definitions that I'm giving it. But Cinderella, Snow White, Peter Pan, these are all fundamentally girl movies. Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. And we were working on Aladdin. Aladdin was a boy movie, certainly, but at the time we had no idea if it was going to be successful. But I was interested in Africa and African art and African rhythms, and I was thinking about Bambi a lot because it is a very powerful film, yet there's no real story. It's really just 4 seasons. And it's really the story about how Bambi becomes his father, right? He replaces the stag on the bluff overlooking the forest. So
that was the vision.
That was the vision, and so I thought, we could do this with lions in Africa and the Serengeti, and the young lion cub replaces his old grizzled father on the Kapchi overlooking the Serengeti, except it's African rhythms, and it's just like Bambi, but completely different, which is the way most movies are pitched in Hollywood. They're like a really successful movie, but they're completely different and original and new.
And so that's where the idea came from.
And it was great. I mean, Peter and Jeff Katzenberg were always like me and always gave me plenty of rope. And Katzenberg made fun of me relentlessly because he's like, Fink, if you figure out why Bambi eats all the other animals, you've got a picture. Because I don't know how you're going to explain that. And eventually we came up with the Circle of Life, which... And then we soft pedaled like crazy. So between the Circle of Life and soft pedaling like crazy, we had a picture. And of course, very important lesson in that movie. I left Disney about 6 months before it was released, and Jeffrey took total credit for the movie. Roy Disney and the director of the movie were very kind and talked about my contribution to the film. And obviously, no one person is the creator of an animated movie. They're made by hundreds of talented artists and craftsmen. But they were kind enough to acknowledge the origination of the film with my idea. Of course, Jeffrey completely spun it into being, it was his idea, the story of his life. No, it was the story of how you made fun of me in story meetings. It wasn't the story of your life. But, one of the morals of the story is history is written by the living.
Yes, and the people who were there.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean, right? History is written by the living, whether at a corporation or on the battlefield.
Now, I may be reading too much into this just from our background, which had a lot to do with Shakespeare, but weren't there some Shakespearean influences there? I mean, I look at The Lion King and I see little bits and pieces of Hamlet where somebody killed somebody else, and then, I mean, were there parallels there intentionally, or am I just stretching?
You are and you aren't. We had several treatments of The Lion King that we tried to do King Lear at one point. We tried I don't think we ever tried Hamlet, but we looked to Shakespeare frequently for archetypal stories, which was his unique gift, was telling these stories that sort of speak to, the human soul throughout generations and, as it turns out, centuries. So of course we spent a lot of time thinking about Shakespeare and what did he know and what stories, what were the archetypes that he was getting at. So we thought about Shakespeare a lot, and of course the character of Scar, the bad guy, is very theatrical. Right. So I think that probably was the remaining Shakespearean influence, was that character, because he was like the uncle from Hamlet.
Right, and that's sort of how I always saw it. I always saw it as a huge parallel.
It was Bambi in Africa, but the bad guy was the uncle from Hamlet.
All right, that'll work. And then you moved over to the live action side. How did you like that?
I hated it. I hated it for a couple of reasons. First of all, I always succeeded, and I succeeded in animation by working harder than the other guys. I worked really hard. 18-hour days, reading scripts over the weekend, and that made me one of the hardest working guys in the animation division, and I got a lot of respect for that. On the live action side of the company, everybody worked that hard. Plus, a lot of those guys didn't have a young family. They were schmoozing movie stars. They were schmoozing producers. They were out there fighting for the next hot spec script. And, I didn't really do that. Plus, I was wearing the world's biggest Kick Me sign on the back that said, "Kick Me, animation hotshot, teacher's pet." So, I probably got assigned to all the talking dog movies. I got assigned that horrifying movie that came out a couple of years ago, Dinosaur. And this was in 1991. So that's how long it took to make that piece of caca. And so if anybody ever asks you about Hollywood, why do they make so many bad movies? They're not sitting there saying, let's make a bad movie. That just happens when you do it wrong. They're actually trying to make good movies. They're very smart, sincere people working as a committee. And we all know what there are two things about committees. There are no statues erected in memories of a committee. And then there's another great aphorism: a camel is a horse designed by a committee. So they put me on all the talking dog movies. I did Incredible, Homeward Bound, The Incredible Journey, which was an incredibly difficult film to make. It was actually filmed here in the Cascades. And so it was kids and animals in the woods. And the producer dropped dead on the 6th day of filming. The kids literally, he had a brain aneurysm and died. The kids couldn't act. They could only work 6 hours a day, so they couldn't act, which meant that hundreds of takes of every shot, and then they had to go to school. And then you had the problem of just making a film with we had 8 cats and 5 dogs, and of course the cats would get full and they wouldn't come out of their cages. It was just a disaster. And we finally got it back into the editing room, and then Jeffrey kept recasting the voices, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost, and then yelling at me about the cost overruns. So it was a very, very tough situation, and I think that the truth is they didn't really want to move me over to the live action side of the company, but it was something they promised me if I succeeded in animation. I was ambitious. I was a young vice president, and I thought animation, I could get stuck here. What I like to say now is if I had had that job at 39 instead of 29, I never would have left. But, at that point, it was 1991. We had movies several years out. I was feeling bored and antsy. I was feeling like I wasn't, going to advance much there. And I felt like I needed to get over to, if I was going to run a studio by the time I was 35, I needed to get over to the live action side of the company. But I think that was a miscalculation, and I just, it was my energy and my impatience which led me to move over to live action. It wasn't, as I look back on it, smart enough or strategic enough. But remember, all the people who were giving me advice at the time were saying, you got to get over to live action. You're going to die in animation. You're going to be forgotten. You won't be hot anymore. So, you have to go where you can keep going, man.
Well, it's another good lesson about really kind of listening to your instincts and letting them start to talk to you. So you said that after the Incredible Journey, you were about done with Disney and they were about done with you.
I think that's a fair statement.
What happened next?
Well, I was really, we had used computers and email, and obviously we had used computers to make animated films and to assist us in the making of animated films quite a lot. So when I came over to the live action side of the company, I was shocked to see, there were no online databases, no online tracking of story reports, no email distribution of story reports. So I started to get really interested in the electronic medium, and my sense was that the public's, just as my sense in 1986 was that the public's imagination was going to be captured by animated movies, so I felt in 1992 that the public's imagination was going to be captured by the personal computer. And there was absolutely nobody at Disney who thought that. In fact, they all thought that I was brain damaged, except for Roy Disney, who said, you know, you ought to talk to Timmy about that, because Timmy is interested in
Timmy
computers.
is his son.
Tim Disney had worked for me as a writer in the mid-'80s at Disney Animation. He's a very bright, Harvard-educated guy who also was interested in computers. And he and I had remained friendly, and so we started to talk about partnering together and really looking at the computer industry, either starting a software company or perhaps buying a small software company. And eventually we found such a company in Chicago called Virtual World Entertainment that did a combination of software production, role-playing games, licensing, and they had this one really fun little arcade in Chicago called the BattleTech Center, which was a themed attraction, which is still at Chicago's North Pier Terminal, which is a little tourist mall there where essentially they had a network of these modified military flight simulators, but rather than networking you into 10,000 square miles of sky, where it's very hard to find other people, they put you at the controls of a walking robot on the planet Solaris 7. And what was so compelling and captivating about it was that you were really interacting with other people. The simulators were really you know, just a tool for bringing people together in a virtual world. And we invented other games that you could that would put you in a virtual world with other people, because it was really the other people. It was really Tim piloting that robot that I was shooting at that was compelling. And our sense was that this was going to end up on the internet. And in fact, you know, that sort of was one of the main reasons that was driving our interest in the company. Of course, it was going to take years for that to evolve. I'll tell you, an interesting metaphor for that is there's a fantastic Nintendo 64 game called GoldenEye. And it was a 4-player game. You'd see 4 kids in the basement, all had a quarter of the screen, and they were stalking each other through this maze. And the most amazing thing would happen, you know, one kid would shoot the other in the back, and the other kid would throw his controller down and start beating on the other kid. So, I mean, to me, you know, that was what was exciting about Virtual World and the opportunity that it presented. But we were years ahead of our time, and we really ended up being in 2 of the nastiest businesses you could ever really find yourself in. One was the shrink wrap software business in 1993 and 1994, in which, you know, the retailers had all the power, and the developers undertook all the expense and took all the risk. And the other was the arcade business, which really more than anything else is about real estate deals and clean bathrooms. So 2 extremely nasty, unglamorous businesses, but it did give me an opportunity to get deeper into the computer industry and into the software industry, to start to understand more about interactivity. It put me into business with AOL and MSN and CompuServe and Genie and you know, Delphi and some of those names of the past. But we had a relationship with AOL. And through that relationship, as it became clear that Virtual World was going to have to become just much more of a software company and much more of an arcade company, you know, AOL ultimately offered me a job. And it was a great segue. So Virtual World was my MBA. And it was also a great stepping stone for me to step out of the movie industry and into the world of interactivity. And so my instinct that interactivity and the internet were going to capture the imagination of the American public and eclipse the movie business was correct. Just the way it was going to happen was not. It was a bit unexpected.
So what did you end up doing at AOL initially?
AOL hired me in early 1996, in January of 96, to be their vice president and of creative development for a business they called the AOL Greenhouse, which was an incubator for online sites and online ideas.
This was fairly early on in AOL. They had how many people at this time?
There were about 900 people. And one of the things about AOL which was interesting was what AOL really had. Just take a trip down memory lane, right? It's early 1996, and what AOL had was email, internet access. They didn't have instant messages yet. They had internet access. They had a really crappy internet browser. They had chat rooms, and they had repurposed print content, right? AOL at that time was paying Time Warner and others for repurposed print content that they put online. And their value proposition was you never have to buy another magazine, right? Because it's all online. Of course, reading things online was spectacularly unpleasant.
Right.
And Ted Leonsis, who was a very visionary guy who had come to the company in '93, realized this, that AOL was not going to go to the next level on repurposed content from major media companies to whom AOL was paying millions of dollars. So his sense was, let me get a bunch of entrepreneurs to do native online sites that leverage the medium. And today, of course, this is a big so what, but at the time it was a big duh.
Deal. Yeah.
And so the Greenhouse was going to incubate lots of little companies, and some of them turned out to be quite successful in their day. The Motley Fool is still chugging along and is profitable. iVillage is starting to turn a corner. So these were some of the companies that we incubated, but we also did some others. Real Fan Sports Network, which was sold to CBS Sportsline. We did a brand for women called Electra, which we sold to Oxygen. And we did Entertainment Asylum, which was the subject of John Gearland's book, Digital Babylon, which we did with Brandon Tartikoff and Scott Zakarin and Troy Blotnick, the guys who created The Spot. So we did some pretty interesting and revolutionary things between '96 and it was really a 2-year period. Greenhouse was shut down in early '98.
And why did they shut it down?
Well, basically at that point, AOL was hemorrhaging money. There was a sense that was correct on AOL's part that the pendulum had swung the other way, and now media companies were going to pay AOL to provide access to our audience. So you can't really charge E to be on AOL if they're competing with AOL's Entertainment Asylum. So, AOL spun off companies that could stand on their own, and companies that couldn't went out of business, and then ones in the middle ultimately got sold.
And then from there you moved into channel programming. What were sort of your day-to-day responsibilities as part of the channel programming area?
I was vice president of entertainment and leisure, which was one of the great titles of all time. What it really meant was I was in charge of channel programming for all the AOL channels that were not sports, news, shopping, and personal finance. And what those channels really were was a platform, and they still are, honestly, a platform for AOL's content distribution deals. And then we would work with different content partners to figure out which programming from which partner to highlight, which was interesting, of course, because we had, for example, on the women's channel on AOL, which I created, was powered by Oxygen, iVillage, and Women.com. So we were constantly sort of time shifting that screen and those promotions to try and keep those partners who were paying us satisfied. So that's what that job really was about. And I did that job for about a year, and then I got reorganized AOL, they just had a reorg today. I don't know how a company ultimately survives when it reorganizes itself every 6 months, because there's no continuity. I know, there's no continuity of management.
Major reorg every 2 years, minor one every 6 months.
Yeah, it's stunning to me, but AOL has become sort of like Disney. They always manage to pull themselves away from the brink, but they irresistibly rush toward it. My final job at AOL, I was creative director for the AOL service, which meant that I came up with great ideas for new businesses and then got told why we couldn't do them. So eventually I left AOL.
Yeah, that's not a fun job for long.
No, it isn't. And I did that for about 6 or 8 months, and I had the sense when they weren't actually doing any of the things that I suggested that this was not a good long-term job for me, and I tried to get myself into another lifeboat because I saw the Netscape thing on the horizon, and following a big merger, companies take a write down, and that means they basically go and they find underperforming employees and they package them out, and they find senior vice presidents who get paid a lot of money but aren't supervising any people, and you usually get packaged out too. So I tried to find a lifeboat, and I didn't. Although leaving AOL at that moment for any number of reasons, turned out to be among the best things that ever happened to me. I don't know if I said this to you, but AOL and Disney have a lot in common. First of all, they're great alumni associations, and they're great places to have been, but they're extremely difficult and demanding places to work.
Right. So you left AOL, and pretty much financially you could do anything you want. So what did you decide to do for a while?
I told my wife, well, first I said, well, I don't know. I interviewed for a couple of big jobs at big companies, including the job of running Roadrunner, although when I got to my third interview with the Roadrunner guys, I said, you know, you guys really actually don't want to do anything. This is really just politics and bullshit. They said, well, yeah, what do you think the president of Roadrunner does? I mean, that's what all the presidents at Time Warner do. So I realized that I was not going to take a job at a big company, whether in senior or middle management again. And I just, you know, took time to think and coached Little League Baseball. I joined a golf club. I told my wife I was going to get good at golf again. And she said, golf was not disclosed at the time of the union. And I have to say, I've become quite obsessed with it, which is a very sort of embarrassing middle 40s thing to kind of have to admit, but it does give you a lot of good thinking time. And idea production has never been a problem for me.
Right.
And now it's mid-99, and you know, venture capitalists are you know, running around with bags of money looking for people with resumes and ideas. So I had an idea, which was to provide the personalized daily newspaper the internet always promised and delivered, a kind of intelligent agent that would be waiting for you every morning when you opened your email. Because one of the things that became abundantly clear when I was at AOL is the thing that people value more than anything else in the interactive medium, in the internet, is email.
Right.
Email is the killer app
because
it's personal and because it's just for you. So my idea was a personalized daily email that would harvest content from sites that you stipulated. So you tell me, you know, I want to find out what's new on Martha Stewart, I want my news, I want my weather, I want Dilbert, and I package it all together and drop it into your email box, totally free, full of advertising, and the two revenue sources were content companies paying me to get traffic to their sites,
right,
and advertisers who wanted to reach people with a lot of personalized information. So I financed e-agents with backing from Draper, Fisher, Jurvetson. It's actually the East Coast affiliate, Draper Atlantic, Lazard Technology Partners, which is Lazard Frere's Internet Venture Group, and Shamrock Holdings, which is the Disney family investment vehicle. And we got financed in November of '99, and it became a lot more difficult to maintain my interest in golf, but I got to build something from scratch for the first time that was all my own, and it was very exciting and a lot of fun and very nerve-wracking, but it turned out to be very successful for a moment in internet time. But it was but the moment held long enough for us to be acquired by a real company before it all came tumbling down on the pillars of salt and saliva that it was built on.
One of the other interesting things that you did during this time was you hired your brother. And was that an easy decision for him to make to come work for you? And was it an easy decision for you to make to offer him the job?
It was an easy decision for me to make to offer him the job, but you always work, whether you have a 20-person company that you own the majority of, or whether you're at a medium-sized company like AmericanGreetings, you always work as a team. So I couldn't just hire my brother and install him. We had a need for another business development executive with legal skills. And he was a very good candidate, in my opinion. He understood the internet very well. He had been a litigator for 15 years. He was looking to make a change. He wanted to be in a startup environment, and what I was doing was exciting to him. And so, you know, my wife thought I was crazy, but, and in fact, you know, my partners were not certain of my sanity either, but, you know, I had him interview not only with people inside the company, but with some of the board members, and, you know, I told them all, you know, look, it's my brother, but I think he's the right guy for the job. And they humored me. They allowed me to hire him. And I have to say it was a great experience and really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But he is a very talented guy. He did me proud. He was cheap. So it turned out very well for all involved. But it was a certain leap of faith for me and certainly for him.
Yeah, I would think that would be a very tough thing to do, to work for a brother, even an older brother. I think that would be really rough. So now you've sold the company to American Greetings, but you decided to stay on. What was your role with the new company?
Well, there are a couple things. I mean, I didn't sell the company for cash. I sold it to another startup,
Right.
albeit a startup owned by, Fortune 500 company, and a well-financed startup at that. American Greetings certainly was a company which was and is still developing and is still being built and is still solidifying its business model, although I think we have found a real sustainable business model. But at the time, American Greetings was extraordinarily dependent on AOL. And, they had just pulled their IPO. They had, an extremely large organization with no employees in sales and marketing. So there was clearly a lot of work to do there. The transaction was a stock transaction, and American Greetings stock was illiquid. But American Greetings really, needed me. Which, coming back to a theme of a small company with a lot of opportunity, where I felt needed and I could make a difference. And I have a great relationship with the CEO, who is a friend and a partner, as well as a great boss. And he actually brings out the best in me, which is exciting, because all of us, no matter how senior we are, need to be pushed and to be challenged.
Right.
And certainly I need somebody who's going to give me a gut check and ask me, why do you think that? And it's interesting, because I also provide that for Joseph Mandelbaum, who is the CEO. So we have this sort of great push and pull relationship, and a lot of our employees joke, you guys are so married, because we are. I spend more time with Joseph some weeks than I spend with my wife. But it's a lot of fun. The company has great people. I really believe in it. Interestingly, it leverages what is the killer app. I mean, it is an email application. It connects people to people, yet it does so through the medium of these 15 and 30-second cartoons. So I would say that the cartoon is being reborn, particularly in the context of these online greetings. And so it kind of pulls together everything I did at AOL and Disney Animation and Virtual World and even at eAgents, which lives on as the email platform for Pass It Around, which is one of our flanker brands. So I'm having a lot of fun, and I like to say that I'm in the fun business. I've always been in the fun business. One of the great blessings of my life and my career is that, with very few exceptions, I've never felt like I was doing a job that wasn't mostly fun. In fact, I always have this giddy feeling like, I can't believe they're paying me to do this, and I still feel that way. I still feel sometimes my paycheck shows up on my desk and I'm surprised, because it's so not about the money. It's about the people and it's about the work, and that is a very privileged place to find oneself in one's life.
What kind of culture have you tried to create at AmericanGreetings.com among the employees?
Well, most of the people who work for me are artists or people who manage artists. Now, I do have people in the marketing department who work for me, and I treat them somewhat differently than I treat the people in our creative studio or the people who are managing our brands. But it is an environment where people work hard and have fun. In fact, the motto of eAgents was save time, have fun, right? Because one of the things that is great about the internet is it's a convenience tool. When the internet is working really well, it saves you time. Of course, with all that saved time, what we generally do is, we waste it surfing around looking for something else, looking for things that entertain or interest us. But I try to create an environment where I can nurture talented people, mostly by just giving them an opportunity to do their best work and challenging them to do work that's better than they think their best work is. It's somewhat different in the marketing and product management areas, which are under my supervision. But those executives I treat as I would like to be treated. I ask them hard questions. Joseph asks them hard questions, and I try to give them the resources to do their jobs. Interestingly, there was a guy who, in the waning days of Virtual World, that came in to be president of a company, a guy by the name of Denny Thorley, who had years of experience in the software industry and was a very bright and tough-minded manager. But he said that the job of management is to provide leadership, to define the mission, and to provide the resources to do the job. And I really took that to heart, because I thought that was a great truism.
Very simple.
And it was very simply stated. And you know, it's kind of the metric I look at the people who work for me through, right? Do they understand the mission? Do they know how to ask for it, define, and use the resources? And then when I evaluate people and when I coach them on an ongoing basis, you know, I tend to focus on those issues. Are they providing leadership?
Right.
Because what a real leader does is he creates other leaders.
Right.
So there are times when I've been doing my job as president of the AmericanGreetings.com network where I've felt like I'm not needed, which is when I feel my most successful. Right. When I feel like I'm doing other people's jobs for them is when I feel like I haven't really empowered them and enabled them to succeed.
And then it's kind of frustrating in a sense because it can be sort of irritating.
It is, although I, you know, the truth is I'm perfectly happy to do anybody's job, you know, but if I were them, I wouldn't be too happy to have me come in and start doing it.
Yeah. What are some of the special things about talent management? Because you're not necessarily only managing business people, but you talked about the concept of talent management.
Right. When we were chatting it before the show started, I mentioned that you know, starting with Disney and really a theme throughout my career has been managing talent, and you know, it's interesting because you know, every talent is unique, so there is no talent management philosophy that you can apply the way you can apply a business philosophy about leadership. Because when you're managing talent, you really have to look at the individual and say, what does this person do well? What is their, when you say talent, what's their unique talent? Who do they need around them? What kind of support do they need? Because every artist and every unusually talented manager is going to have strengths and weaknesses, and you try and assign them jobs and missions that play to their strengths and that, you know, minimize their weaknesses.
Right. So that's basically the focus of it. You've always described yourself as sort of a no details guy, but that you're more the visionary, yet you get so passionate about the projects that you do. I tend to be more of a control freak, and I just want to know, how do you let go?
Sometimes I don't. I mean, eventually my weaknesses force me to let go. What I've learned to do is I know where I'm weak. You know, I don't like a lot of the detail and execution. I like the strategy. I like the vision piece. I like casting, if you will, the people who are going to execute. And then I like to check back in with them along the way. I like there to be a system of controls and a schedule so everybody knows how they're doing, and I like to set the standards. But in terms of the nitty-gritty of executing, I like to find people who are better than that than I am. One of the epiphanies I had was when I first came to Disney. I still was nurturing fantasies about being a writer and a director, and I had an epiphany in which I realized that there were people who were more talented and more detail-oriented and more disciplined who could execute my ideas, and that there were people who were more focused and more talented who could direct them. And that sort of led me, it sort of took a weight off my shoulders because I felt like, oh, I don't have to be Orson Welles, right? I can be David O. Selznick, if you will, who was a very famous creative producer. I can guide those talented people. Right. I can collaborate with them on ideas, but the day-to-day work of getting every shot, of editing, of realizing what shots are missing, of continuity, of all of that, because films in particular are comprised of hundreds of thousands of tiny details that a director made a decision about every single one of them.
Right.
And it's overwhelming when you look at a film, even a single shot or a set, that the director agonized about the way the costume blended with the color of the upholstery and the pictures on the wall, and combined that with all the other details and nuances about acting and camera angles and editing and music and sound effects. And, you know, it's great not to worry about all that, just to worry about what is the movie about? Who's going to make it? How are we going to market it? And I've looked at every project since then on the same basis.
It's been kind of freeing.
Yeah, it's been fun. Right, I get to do the part that's fun to me and then move on. And I take credit for the successes and allow others to take credit for the failures.
How fair. What are some of the characteristics that you look for in new employees that you hire?
Well, I try and find people who I think are enthusiastic, who think outside the box, who challenge me intellectually, who think differently than I think, people who are ambitious, One of the things that kind of has amazed me, particularly at American Greetings, although I never really saw this at AOL or at Disney or running a small software company, is what you see at American Greetings, which are these people who are content to be middle managers all their life. People who are content to do sort of one $70,000 a year job for 25 years and then retire. And you know, the world needs those people, and I don't undervalue them, and I think many of them are tremendous people and totally necessary to our company's success, but I totally don't relate to it.
Right.
And so perhaps I reveal a weakness, because I'm always looking for people who are like me, who I can relate to, who don't want to do the same job for more than a couple of years,
right,
but who eventually want my job. So when I'm interviewing people, I look for somebody who's got that fire in the belly and that ambition, rather than somebody I think is looking for a sinecure.
Right. And that's worked out obviously pretty well.
It's worked out okay, given that I've been mostly in the area of creative development.
We'll be back to take questions from the audience right after this.
The University of Washington Business School, located in Seattle, Washington, ranks among the top business schools in the United States. Information Technology Leaders is one of the many ways the UW Business School forges partnerships and reaches out beyond the university. For more information about the University of Washington Business School or Information Technology Leaders, visit informationtechnologyleaders.com.
It seems as though you have AmericanGreetings.com figured out as far as revenue and how it's going to go from there. And it would seem that once you figure stuff out, you like to move on. And you're very excited, and I could tell that you really like Hollywood. And I was wondering if you're thinking about making a return back to Hollywood, or whether you'd like to stay in the internet world for a little while longer.
I've always wanted to build a successful company in interactive media, and I've been trying to do so since 1992. So I'd like to see this one through. Is that 2 years? Is that 3 years? I don't know. And, you know, are there going to be other challenges at the company that engage me? I hope so. I really like the people and I like working there. And I think I have a little more maturity than I had in the past, so maybe my tenure here will rank among my longest. What I'll do next is hard for me to say. My guess is that I'll start something new. I don't want to work for anybody else. I don't think that I will go back to making films, although I toy with the idea from time to time, but it's tremendously difficult to make films in Hollywood today. Making films in Hollywood today, particularly for producers, is really more about selling and packaging than creating. You know, there are lots of great stories running around, but they only happen if Tom Hanks is interested and this director is interested, and so a lot of that is about the politics of Hollywood and the politics of the big media conglomerates that finance movies today. It's much more about properties and franchises than it is about individual creators or creative producers. But I would never say never. I do love movies. I love watching movies, and you know, they're a big part of my life, and I love storytelling, so we'll see. But meanwhile, those parts of me that love storytelling and love working with artists are being satisfied working on the internet. So perhaps I'll continue there. It's hard to say. One thing I have learned over the past 20 years is that particularly in new media, you'd be a fool to predict a year in advance. So I don't even try anymore. I just try to see where the puck is going and hope that we can be going in the same direction.
Our closing quote is particularly touching in that it comes from his brother. Charlie's greatest business asset is his personality. He is brash, boisterous, utterly self-confident, smart and funny, with a touch of a messianic streak. This guy is like a living Looney Tunes character, a CEO on steroids. It's fun just being around him. It's always a whirl of activity and he's at the center. His enthusiasm is infectious. He'll make a believer out of you despite your better judgment, out of sheer force of personality. That's a tremendous gift. You can't fake it. Few people can truly carry it off. He can. As a CEO of a .com startup, this guy is a natural. Sometimes you just have to stand back and marvel at it. Good job. Really good.